Hey y'all, it's Candace here with Slusher Consulting, non-medical home care consulting. I want to talk today about live-ins. I hear those questions come up a lot. They come up on Facebook groups, and my clients ask me, is it a good idea that they have clients asking for live-in? So it's a double-edged sword. It's a great option for families who need some sort of 24-hour monitoring but can't afford 24 hours of actual shift and hourly work, because you're looking at, 18 to $23,000 a month for 24-hour care with shifts, right? And with live-in, they can probably keep it, less than 10,000, and that is more doable for some people in order to keep them out of an assisted living or nursing facility. So there's just some things we have to consider when we're doing live in. And prior to 2015, this wasn't such a big deal because non medical home care, caregivers, attendants, providers, those things came under like a waiver, an exemption for overtime. We fell in with domestic and farm workers in that caregivers were working 80 to 100 hours a week and not getting paid overtime. And that's not necessarily right, but that's the way it was. And of course, everyone was reaping the benefits, both the caregivers and the agencies. Well, then in 2015, overtime became an issue. And it's fine. It's great that caregivers get their due. They should get paid overtime just like anybody else does. They're certainly not salaried workers, but at the same time, it was a real challenge, kind of a struggle for a lot of existing agencies, and we had to make a lot of changes. And so since then, the overtime exemption that falls under live-in is a little more strict and specific. So I want to talk about that. But I want to start with billing and paying. Okay, so you would be able to bill a daily rate, not an hourly, and pay a daily rate, not an hourly, if you fall under the Department of Labor exemption for overtime rules for specifically for live-in. So let me go through that. Rule number one, the caregiver has to be in the client's home for at least 5 days. That's 120 hours in a row without leaving, in order for them to be exempt from overtime. Okay, which means if you're going to staff that, you have to be at a 5-day on and then maybe staff shifts for the other 2 days, or you can do 1 week on and 1 week off with two different people if you have the two people. So those considerations need to be made. That's the first thing. 5 days in a row, no exception. So you can't do a 4 days on, 3 off. That doesn't work. Okay. The second thing is the care recipient needs to not require more than 20% of the entire time that they're there should be on personal care. So if you're looking at 24 hours in a day, there's going to be time for sleep, but they shouldn't need constant care. So basically, if someone has dementia and needs a lot of intervention, if it's beyond early stages and it's into mid to late stages, they need a lot more intervention. And so it's definitely more than 20% of the time spent there is going to be spent on some sort of care. So that almost always does not count. So that's the deal. And then also there needs to be a room and board situation. Okay. So the caregiver shouldn't necessarily have to bring their own groceries for the 5 days that they're there. They're going to prepare and eat the client's food with them. And then also they need a dedicated place to sleep. Now it doesn't have to be in a separate room. It could be in the room with the client, although that doesn't allow the caregiver the privacy that they probably should have for a live-inable situation. So you always need to, it's case by case. You always need to evaluate, is this live-inable? Okay. Does the client only need moderate care, less than 20% of the time spent? Is there a space for the caregiver to sleep overnight, at least 6 to 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep? It is possible that they could get up one time at night, but not more than that. If they're getting up 2 or 3 times, by the second or third day, they're chopped liver anyway, and you shouldn't do that to your caregivers. But now they're no longer meeting that requirement for overtime exemption. So room and board, so food and a place to sleep, less than 20%, 5 days in a row. There are no exceptions to those. And in the description below this video on YouTube, there will be a link to the Department of Labor fact sheet about overtime and live-in exemptions. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about other considerations. Staffing is a thing. Now, truly, I mean, I almost say there's a time when caregivers didn't know what they were worth. And at some point in the last 10 years or so, caregivers have stepped up and said, wait a minute, why would I stay gone from my own home for 5 whole days and not get paid for all the time that I'm gone? And so in general, a lot of agencies stopped having as many people willing to do live-in situations. And that did kind of coincide with the overtime because caregivers learned, oh, now we're getting overtime and you still want me to stay for 120 hours and not get paid for that, right? So we saw a big shift there in just the culture and what people will accept and what they'll do. And good for them for advocating for themselves. Um, but then the other issue is you have to have somebody who can be gone away from their home for 5 to 7 days at a time, which means they don't have any kids. They probably don't even have a cat that needs to be taken care of, or they live with someone else who can manage things at home while they're gone. And that's fine, but that really narrows down your pool of people, just because that's a big commitment for people. If they can't do just 2 or 3 days and still fit in that parameter, then you're looking at having a much smaller number of people who will agree to be gone from their home for 5 solid days at least. The other thing is you're looking at a certain caliber of professional for those who can be gone. Maybe, age could be a factor, or they've hurt their back and so they can't really do those bigger shifts anymore, but this client doesn't need lifting. And, they're able to do the minimum amount that's needed for the client. And that might work out for everybody because you're also looking for, not just skills and technical and physical, but also personality. They need to just be the right person and the right fit. And when it is the right fit, isn't that beautiful? Um, but you do need to be making sure that you're monitoring people in these situations. So when you have a caregiver who stays with the client for 7 whole days, um, it might be your tendency as an owner or supervisor to back off and say, well, they've got it. They don't need frequent supervision. But it's very easy, even for the best caregivers, the most professional caregivers, to get complacent, to get a little too comfortable in a client's home when they're not clocking in and out and really being accountable to anybody else for 5 to 7 whole days. So that can be a little bit of an issue. I mean, it can be a really big issue. If you're not looking, you don't really know what's happening. So I would recommend, if you choose to go through with live-ins, and everything works out and you can get it staffed and everybody's happy and got their needs met, you still need to be doing supervisory visits, probably pop-ins at least once a week at the beginning, and then maybe every other week ongoing, because they need to know that there is monitoring, that somebody's watching what's going on. Of course, a lot of clients now have the families put cameras in the home, so there is some monitoring, and that's helpful. But you might even want to ask for access to that camera so that you can check yourself. If you don't, especially maybe if it's far, far away and you don't have an option to drive out there every single week, but just make sure that you're paying close attention, because the minute you're not looking, anything could go wrong. It's very easy to cover up something that happened when there's no shift changes. Okay. Supervision is important. Caliber of caregiver is important. So when we're talking about staffing options, again, you have this 5 day. If you're going to do the minimum of 5 days and give somebody off the weekend, well, then you would staff probably 8 or 12 hour shifts on the weekends. And so that would be a little higher cost for the client. They're still saving money Monday through Friday, but then they'd have to, pay real dollars on the weekends. The other thing might be that if 5 days doesn't work out, if maybe you really have somebody that says, I can stay 3 days a week, but I can't stay longer than that, then you are going to have to pay them overtime. Okay. Hopefully you have a scheduling software system that already calculates your overtime, because billing overtime is optional. Paying overtime is not optional, and you need to protect yourself as an agency. Do not ever allow someone to work more than 40 hours without being paid the legal overtime at time and a half. It is very important, and the Department of Labor has been doing a lot more auditing of agencies and being very responsive. If you're in a place where, if you're in a state where unions are a thing, there's been a lot more talk about caregivers unionizing. And so any little discrepancy when it comes to overtime could be a big issue. And so you need to be mindful of that. But for instance, If you're paying someone $240 a day, that's a nice $10 an hour flat rate, okay? If you're paying them $240 a day and they're not working the full 5 days, then you're going to want to put the schedule in your system as 24-hour shifts at $10 an hour. And then that last, if they're working 3 days, that's 72 hours. So they're going to get 32 hours of overtime. That might be worth it with what you're billing the client. So if you're, paying 240 a day, you might be billing 400 or 430 a day. So if you can afford the overtime within that pay rate, great. If you can't and you're trying to stick within that 240 a day, you might need to back that down a little bit and say, so for your first 40 hours, you're going to get paid $8 an hour, which in some states is still, legal minimum wage. You have to pay at least minimum wage. You can't pay less than that wherever you are. And then after that, you'll get time and a half. So time and a half on $8 is $12 an hour. So you would look at maybe the full amount that they're getting paid for the week and divide that out so that they're still getting paid overtime legally. They have to accept that for this live-in client, I am taking a wage reduction, understanding that they're going to get, how much they're going to get in the long run. So you're going to need to do some math on that to make sure that you are protected and that your caregivers understand if they're working less than 5 days, there will be overtime, but this is what the pay rate's going to be for that, and make sure that they accept that. I would get that in writing, maybe not even just a text, but have them sign a form that says they understand this is the pay schedule for this client or this situation. I think that's really it. Just make sure that you read and understand the Department of Labor overtime exemption rules. Check that link. Understand your staffing options. Make sure that you're very clear upfront with the clients that I understand this is what you want. We're going to do our best for for live-ins. Some agencies specialize in live-in, and that's great. If you have a lot of people that will do that, if you've got a good formula for it, then you probably have a niche, because most agencies don't do live-in just because it seems complicated. Hopefully, today's video took out some of the complications for you and that you feel like you can move forward with this. Good luck.